Now, let's talk about some of the functions of nonverbal communication. As we know, nonverbal communication conveys meaning, and it does so by reinforcing, substituting for, or contradicting verbal communication. If nonverbal communication is reinforcing verbal communication, our gestures might be describing a space or a shape that another person is unfamiliar with in ways that words alone cannot. So we are reinforcing the basic meaning of what it is that we are verbally saying. So for example, we might point to the door when telling someone that they should leave. That would be a reinforcing gesture, right? If our gestures are instead substituting for verbal communication, those gestures are taking the place of the words. So rather than saying, "you can leave," and pointing at the door, we might simply point at the door. Or else we might demonstrate the shape and size of something simply by holding out our hands, right? So we might say, "that fish I caught was this big," and we'd hold our hands out nice and wide, rather saying, "this fish was 24 inches long," or whatever else, right? So the gesture or the piece of nonverbal communication is taking the place of that verbal communication. And then finally, our nonverbal communication might contradict the verbal messages that we are sending. So they aren't quite matching up. And as we were saying previously, when we are receiving mixed messages, we tend to trust the nonverbal messages over the verbal ones. Another function that nonverbal communication serves is influencing others. So our nonverbal communication can be used to influence people in a variety of ways. One of the biggest ways, however, is actually deception. So deception is the intentional act of altering information to influence another person. So we might do this by concealing, omitting, or exaggerating information. And oftentimes we intentionally try to control our nonverbal communication when engaging in deception because we don't want our nonverbals to give us away. And deception isn't always malevolent or mean or hurtful, right? Sometimes we have to deceive someone in order to make them feel better or to try to influence the reaction of another person, right? So it's not always a negative thing. In addition, our nonverbal communication regulates our conversational flow. So nonverbal communication helps us to regulate the conversations that we are having so that we aren't constantly interrupting one another or waiting awkward silences in between speaker turns. So we use nonverbal to communicate to one another the turn taking that exists in conversations. So if we want to say something in a conversation, if we would like to have a turn, generally speaking, we would communicate this by opening our mouths and probably taking an audible breath, as well as making direct eye contact with the person who is speaking. If we are speaking in a conversation, we might signal that we are almost finished with our thought by slowing down our pace a little bit and dropping our tone and making eye contact with the person that we are speaking. So things like rate and tone and facial expressions and eye contact all play a really crucial role when it comes to turn taking in conversations. We can also hold the floor non-verbally when we are communicating by looking away from the person that we are speaking to, and by not taking as significant of pauses, by keeping our speaking rate up, right? Lots of really interesting things happening in conversations. Our nonverbal communication also affects our relationships. So in order to successfully relate to other people, we have to have some skill at encoding and decoding and communicating non-verbally. And one of the biggest ways that we communicate that affects our relationships are with tie signs and immediacy behaviors. So tie signs are nonverbal cues that communicate intimacy between two people and signal the connection that exists between them. So these tie signs might be objects such as wedding rings, right? That is a form of nonverbal communication, simply the fact that you have a ring on a certain finger. And touch behaviors such as hand holding also act as tie signs and communicate to the larger world, we are together, right? Because we are walking down the street holding hands with one another. Immediacy behaviors are another really important part of nonverbal communication that impacts our relationships. And in fact, they play a central role in bringing people together. And because of that, they are one of the most important functions of nonverbal communication. And these immediacy behaviors include things like smiling, nodding, making eye contact, and the occasional social and polite touch, right? But all of these things have a really big impact on the relationships that we are trying to form and maintain. And the final function of nonverbal communication is to express our identities. Everything from the way that we set up our living and working spaces, to the clothes that we wear, the artifacts that we surround ourselves with, even our accents of our voices, all have an impact on how we are presenting ourselves to others, how we are expressing our identities. So the clothes that we wear obviously have an impact on the way that others see us and the way that we are expressing our identities. So for example, whenever I am going to work as an instructor, as a teacher, I usually wear my teaching clothes, right? And that sounds really strange, but like I don't normally walk around on a day-to-day basis wearing slacks and blouses or dresses and flats with like long necklaces or whatever. Those are specifically my teaching clothes that I want to wear when I am teaching. But whenever I'm not being teacher Kelsey, I might just wear jeans and a t-shirt, for example. And so the clothes that we are wearing communicates our identity to other people. Additionally, the artifacts that we surround ourselves with communicate our identity. So if you've ever gone into an instructor's office, they usually have things dotted around that have to do with who they are as a person. So they might have a picture on their desk of their family or of their kids, which communicates their identity as a parent to you. They might have a shelf full of books, which communicates the fact that they like to read. Right? And even our accents can communicate our identities in where we come from. So nonverbal communication plays a really important role in how we express ourselves to others, as well as how we convey meaning, how we influence others, how we regulate the conversation between us and others, and how we form and maintain the relationships that we have with others.